let's start. Hello, everyone. Salam, namaste, adab, and welcome to today's event. Today we have a topic which is rarely we see a woman's job making middle lives in New India. That's also the title of a book that the speaker, Dr. Asiya Islam, has written. She's an assistant professor at London School of Economics, UK. She will be formally introduced by Dr. Sidra Kamran, who is an assistant professor of sociology at Lewis and Clark College, Portland, Oregon, here in the United States. And the concluding remarks will be given by Dr. Shannon Phillip, who is an assistant professor in sociology of gender and sexuality at the University of Cambridge. All three speakers, the main and the other two speakers, all their interest is basically on women's gender, sexuality, and workplace in South Asia, I guess, part in Pakistan, part in India. And so welcome you all, and let's have Dr. Sidra Kamran for the formal introductory remarks. Dr. Sidra.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Azuddin and Asiya, for inviting me today. And thank you, everyone, for being here. Let me start with introductions before I speak a bit about the book we'll be discussing. Dr. Asiya Islam is an assistant professor in gender development and globalization at the London School of Economics. She studies the relationship between gender and work in the new service and digital economy of India, and her work advances critical and creative feminist approaches to ethnography. Her research on gender and work in India has been published in many leading journals such as Gender and Society, Sociology, Sociological Review, and Ethnography. Before joining LSE Gender Studies, Asiya was a lecturer in gender and work at the University of Leeds and a junior research fellow at the University of Cambridge. In these positions, she has taught courses related to feminist global political economy, Black feminist theory, and intersectionality, which are subjects that, of course, shape her own research as well. She completed her PhD in sociology from the University of Cambridge and previously studied at the London School of Economics at Aligarh Muslim University. So I first came across Asiya's work when I was working on my own PhD thesis on women in Pakistan service economy, and I've been closely following her work since then. I was quite excited to come across her work, and I'm likewise really excited about this book because although women are increasingly joining the low-wage service economy in South Asia, we don't yet have significant research on this topic. And we do have a lot of work on gender and labor in South Asia in the industrial workforce or home-based workers. So this is a really new area of inquiry that Asiya is looking into. We have some research on the service economy, but the previous research has focused on service workers in the IT sector or more white collar or upwardly, more professional white collar sectors, or even if the work on the low wage service economy has focused on men more than women. So Asiya's book, titled A Woman's Job, Making Middle Lives in New India, which is published by the Cambridge University Press, is thus one of the first monographs to focus on women workers in this particular low-wage service sector of the globalizing economy. Workers in this economy, as Asiya explains, lie somewhere between what is commonly understood as the impoverished working class and the secure middle class. And her book allows us to really grapple with this complicated and difficult to categorize class position. And the best thing is that, Asiya is really attentive to that complicatedness and that straddling between two categories. And instead of trying to impose fixity on something that is so fluid, I think Asiya's theoretical framework really does justice to addressing that fluidity. She draws on ethnographic fieldwork conducted over a number of years and interviews with women who work low-wage service jobs in malls, call centers, cafes, and offices in India. And Asiya skillfully weaves a complex account of urban women's emerging subjectivities. Her book takes us through how women find, experience, and resign from low-wage jobs in the service economy. Interestingly, and I think this is a methodological choice that works really well for the book, Rather than focusing on a specific workplace, which many scholars of gender and work do. For example, I do that in my research, and I think that's commonly something people gravitate to. Asiya instead chooses to focus on the trajectories of workers. So instead of focusing on one workplace, she's moving through different spaces with the workers. And in tracing the movement of women in and out of work, she shows the many ways women occupy a position of duality or in betweenness. And crucial to this story is, of course, the rapid socioeconomic change and globalization, part of the South Asian story right now, which creates a context where gender, class, and caste meanings are both in flux and fixed. So, this simultaneous fixity and change enables women to occupy an in between position as they become active participants in charting out distinct class politics and meanings, which are, as Asiya persuasively shows, inseparable from gender and caste meanings. One of the many things that this book brings to the fore by building on the work of canonical feminist scholars is indeed the impossibility of understanding gender, class, and caste politics as independent from each other. So Asiya does this not by focusing primarily on reviewing complex theoretical frameworks of intersectionality and the co-constitution of gender and class processes, but rather by first introducing the reader to the lives, aspirations, and social relations of women workers. For me, Asia's book is a paradigmatic example of doing theory through ethnography. And it is truly commendable how Asiya leads with her data to build theory from the bottom up. She tells the reader stories about the main characters of her book in a way that seamlessly bring the reader to understand the central theory of mid-identification she proposes. That is, how women workers in the low-wage services sector content themselves with middling and sometimes dual and contradictory aspirations. It's truly a pleasure to read an ethnography that does justice to both narrative and theory, blending the two together in equal measure. So this approach of theory through ethnography that runs through the book also aligns with Asia's commitment to feminist ethnography and feminist politics more broadly. Her book gives the voices of women workers center stage in theorizing their own experiences. Asiya closely builds on these voices to generate theoretical frameworks and also to draw out an analysis of the feminist discomforts, as she labels it, that she experiences during her own research. And I think readers will see that this kind of feminist approach not just informs the book's theoretical framing, but also shapes the thoughtfulness that Asiya, reflects on about which concepts to use and why and how, her methodological choices, and also the really creative structure of the chapters of the book, which I'm sure Asiya will talk more about. I'll just conclude by speaking for a minute about the importance of this book to contemporary scholarship on class and gender in South Asia. So, the category of middle class has, of course, been much debated in South Asia, and has also been a conceptual and political category that dominates sociological research. Despite the salience of this category, many scholars note how unwieldy the concept can be. It's not just that different scholars mobilize the concept of class in different ways, but people themselves seem to think that what counts as middle class, it means very different people means many different things to different people. So Asia's book doesn't shy away from theorizing this complex category of class, and nor does it reproduce the many frameworks and debates that are already offered by scholars. Rather, by really focusing on her interlocutor's narratives, she offers an original theory of middleness and mid-identifications by both building on and departing in creative ways from Beverly Skegg's work on working class women's disidentifications with class. The women workers Asiya spent time with, they adopt these middling positions. For example, they both want to be seen as urban and modern, but they're also anxious about appearing as too modern or fast forward to others. So each chapter kind of dwells on these middling or contradictory aspirations and positions. In a context where class analysis is sometimes overlooked for political reasons, and sometimes because it's genuinely so challenging to do well, Asia's book provides scholars and students of class and gender with creative and accessible new frameworks to understand class and the concept of middle or middle class in a rapidly changing context. As such, it's an invaluable contribution to the fields of gender studies, sociology, anthropology, labor studies, and development studies. And I also think it's going to be a really exciting book to teach precisely because of the theory through ethnography. And I think students will find it really compelling to access complex theoretical frameworks through narratives about these women's lives. There's, of course, much more I'd like to say about the book and Asiya's broader work, but I'll stop here and invite Asiya to speak to us about her book, A Woman's Job, Making Middle Lives in India.
Thank you, Sidra, for that very kind, generous introduction to my work and the book. It's just really nice to actually hear other people speak about the book because I've been immersed in it for so long. I feel like other people are actually doing a better job of explaining it than I probably would. But I'll try to do it justice here in the talk today. Let me just share my screen while I'm setting things up. Okay. It's asking me to quit and reopen, so I might have to just re-enter the call. Just give me a second.
Faisal, you have to make her co-host again, right?
You need to make her co-host again.
Yeah, when she comes back.
Yeah,
I
okay.
thought that she's here. Yeah, she is here. Okay. Yeah.
I think someone will need to make me co-host again so I can switch on my video and the PowerPoint presentation.
Yes, you are now.
Okay, great. Yes, sorry about that. Just all of the technical stuff that happens. Are people able to see my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so I just want to start with saying a big thank you to Dr. Aziuddin for inviting me and for making this possible today. I'm just also trying to switch on my video. Sorry, this is slightly confusing with the different host situations going on. Let me just see if I can switch on my video.
You are switched off, yeah.
I'm just trying to switch on my video so people
Oh,
can.
switch on.
Okay. Can everyone see me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. And you can see the presentation as well.
Yes.
Okay, great, amazing.
You are good to go.
I think we are back on track. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Aziuddin, for inviting me and for making this possible today. And of course, a big thank you to Sidra and Shannon as well for being here and for commenting on the book and for particularly doing it on a Saturday. So I will begin actually with talking about the cover of the book. And I've put the image here that you see in the cover slightly blurred and sketched out, but I wanted to stay first with the cover before I go into talking about the contents of the book and the chapters and the various themes that it explores. So on the cover, what you see is Select City Walk Mall, which is a big mall in South Delhi. Perhaps some of you have been there. You might have visited it in the past. The reason I wanted to have this image on the cover, and this is something that I thought about quite a lot, and I worked with the publishers in terms of trying to find an image that really helps me say on the cover what this book is about. The reason I went for this is because the Select City Mall is one of my field sites, and I'll talk about the kind of research that I did at this mall. But the Select City Mall is also emblematic of changes in post-1990 India. So this is a mall that opened in 2007, and in that time, it was a rarity. It's a huge mall. It has these vast landscaped gardens. It feels very hyper real. But of course, malls of this kind have become much more common in urban India now than they were back in 2007 when the Select City Walk Mall opened. What this mall symbolizes, and this is why it's on the cover, and this is a theme that I explore in the book, what it symbolizes is how the urban landscape of India has changed following the changes that were adopted in the early 1990s. And I'm specifically referring to the adoption of what were known as LPG policies, liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Now, commonly, we would probably understand the mall as a site of consumption. So we might have gone into it as consumers, we might have gone into other malls as consumers. And it is, of course, that, and that in itself tells us something about the way attitudes, including towards consumption, have changed in urban India post 1990. But I also importantly see it as a site of work, and actually as a site of aspirational work or desirable work for lower middle class youth in urban India. And these are lower middle class youth who are trying to capitalize on economic growth that India has witnessed in post 1990s, and they're trying to enter work in these new spaces. So the mall here is emblematic, but I also think about other workspaces, and Sidra mentioned a few of them. I think about cafes, for example, which have also become much more common on the urban Indian landscape. I also think about call centers. I think about high-rise office buildings that are all quite hard to miss if you drive through Delhi on any given day. So in this context, there is growing scholarship on how women have more education and employment opportunities, particularly in the urban services sector in India today, in contemporary India. Now, I wanted to speak a little bit about this because this is something that's obviously quite central to the book, in that when we look at the data that's available on women's participation in education and employment, it gives us a pretty positive picture if you look specifically at education, but I would say a negative picture if you look at the employment data. So if you look at education, the gender gap has been narrowing at all levels of education, including in higher education. In primary education, actually, there are more girls in school now than there are boys, so those kinds of proportions are shifting, and I'm not going to go fully into that data here today. But the reason I mention it is because if you look at the employment data, so there are these periodic labor force surveys that are done in India. And if you look at that data for the last few years, what it's shown is that the women's labor force participation rate is actually quite low. So in 2022-23, it was only recorded at 20% for urban India. And what's also really interesting about this, maybe there are some data nerds out here who would want to explore this further, but one of the things that's really important about this is that if you look at the data for rural India versus urban India, you actually find that there are fewer women, according to that data, in work in urban India, which seems contrary to expectations because obviously India has had economic growth for a while. There has been this massive expansion of the services sector, and these are all trends that you would normally connect with an increased presence of women in the workforce. So there's been quite a lot of debate about why are women in urban India not entering work in the way that they've been expected to, in the way that they're expected to, in the way that we might see this trend in other places in the world. And this is something that economists have debated quite a lot. And I'm not an economist. I'm a sociologist, anthropologist, gender studies scholar by training, which basically means it's my job to criticize the economists in the way that I see it. So the point that I'm really trying to make here is that there is data which is actually quite complex. It can also be quite problematic because it's not easy to measure women's participation in the workforce. I don't know if any of you have seen recently, but there has been a debate over the latest survey results of the periodic labor force survey, which has shown some increase in women's employment rates. The debate that's been going on there is whether that increase can be attributed just to the way work has been defined and measured, right? So that just gives you a little bit of an insight into how it's complex to measure women's workforce participation. So what I do with my work is rather than try to measure women's workforce participation, I pay attention to women's experiences of being in work. And as Sidra said in her introduction, I look at not just women being in work, but actually women also leaving work. And this is something that I'll come to in a few minutes when I take you through the different chapters of the book. Now, alongside this, there is also very rich scholarship, including anthropological, sociological, and economic scholarship on this new middle class in India, in South Asia as well. And actually, this is something that's been discussed globally. In India specifically, this new middle class is associated with India's economic growth post 1990. And the idea is that the new opportunities, so people's income is increasing and people are entering this new middle class. So there's an expansion of the middle class, but it's also new in the sense that it's doing things differently. It has different attitudes, it has different aspirations, and so on. So there's been quite a lot of discussion about this, and again, in terms of measurement, which I won't go into here, but we can, of course, discuss this later in the discussion part of the talk if you would like to. But what I am trying to do with my research and with this book particularly is to bring these two sets of scholarship together. So I think about women's workforce participation as absolutely central to understanding new class politics and new class formations. But importantly, I don't make a linear link between the two. So my argument is absolutely not about how, with women's increased workforce participation, the new middle class is growing. That's not what I suggest at all. What I instead look at are actually contestations over women's workforce participation. So what are some of the questions that emerged? What are some of the issues that arise when women try to enter these new workspaces? And how these are central to this emerging class politics of which new middle class is a part. And we'll get more into that in a second as well. I want to tell you a little bit about how I've gone about doing this research, because again, as Sidra's comments hopefully showed to you a little bit, the method is really central to what I find. The method is really central to this research in that sense. So I've been doing longitudinal ethnographic research since mid-2016 with young women who are seeking work or already working in what I broadly call the new service economy of Delhi. So when I'm talking about the new service economy, the reason I use this term is to differentiate it from what we might conventionally understand the service economy to be. So just to give you an example, women going into paid domestic work are doing service work, but that's not the work that I'm looking at here. So when I'm talking about the new service economy, I'm talking more broadly about the kinds of new workplaces that I made references to that have come up in urban India that young people are now seeking work in. So these would include your cafes, shopping malls, call centers, offices in high-rise buildings, and so on. As part of this longitudinal ethnographic research, what I've done is just spent really long periods of time with the women who I'm trying to study here. And this spending long periods of time is absolutely essential to me being able to build a relationship of trust with them. And one of the things that I want to emphasize here, and again, Sidra has done this already to some extent, but what I want to emphasize is that in this research, I see these young women as the experts on their own lives. So my role as a researcher is not to kind of swoop in and like study these women and say, these are the intelligent things that I can say about their lives. That's not what I do at all. Instead, I see these women's narratives as having epistemic value, as having value that contributes towards knowledge in themselves. And I see my role as a researcher in making macro-micro links, really. So in placing these women's lives and their narratives about their everyday experiences within the wider socioeconomic change in India, and actually more broadly than that, within processes and projects of globalization, development, and modernization around the world. So I try to make those links, looking at women's lives in a micro way, but then connecting them to these wider, bigger macro phenomena. So when I first met these women, they were in their early 20s. They were unmarried. They were living with their families in the neighborhoods of Khanpur and Dakshinpuri in South Delhi. And they had completed secondary school. Some were enrolled in undergraduate programs through distance learning. This was quite common. Some of them actually went on to do postgraduate degrees as well. And I think this was one of the first surprising things that I found when I started doing this research. They were doing jobs that did not require higher education, that did not require university degrees, but they actually saw this as really important to gain a competitive edge in the job market. So these jobs are hugely competitive. It seems like there are lots of them, but actually they're very limited. And to gain an edge in the market, young people do gain extra qualifications, even the qualifications that might not necessarily be needed for the job that they then end up doing. In addition to gaining these qualifications, they also tried to make themselves into service workers. And this is where the role of local employability skills training centers comes in. So in neighborhoods like Khanpur and Dakshinpuri, if you walk around them, you'll see, and I will share some images in a little bit as well that will give you an insight into what these look like. But you'll see these skills training centers, advertising employability skills training programs, and these would include things like learning how to use computers, learning how to speak English, but actually also include quite a lot of instruction on how to behave, how to stand, how to make eye contact, how to shake hands. So there's a whole range of body politics that's also entangled with making these workers, making these young people into workers who are suited for the new service economy. So these are lower middle class youth then being made into workers who are going to cater to clients and customers who come from higher class backgrounds than them. So these skills training centers were actually also quite important and formed part of the field sites that I frequented and that I thought through and that play an important role in the themes that emerge in this research. So with the description that I've offered to you of these women, they could be quite easily characterized as new Indian women or modern Indian women. But I want to disrupt some of that imagery. So they are upwardly mobile. They come from working class backgrounds. Their parents had done working class jobs, so their mothers often had done paid domestic work. Their fathers had done ad hoc labor of various kinds, worked in factories and so on. So in that sense, there was a shift in the work that they were doing. They felt like they were no longer going into necessity-driven work. Instead, they were aspiring towards this work in the new service economy. But at the same time, they were actually quite conscious of the limits of this work. So they went into work where they had these job titles like baristas and brewmasters, retail assistants, executive assistants, customer relations executive, beauty assistants, all of these titles that give you a sense of these jobs being really professional and perhaps of a higher class. But their experience showed, and this will again become evident in the presentation later, they experienced this work actually as quite precarious. It was low paid, it's all on the lower end of the service economy. They felt like there was little avenue for progression. So even when they changed jobs, they seemed to move horizontally rather than vertically. So they recognized that this was work that they were going into that was different from what their parents had done, different from what the previous generation had been able to do. And they felt like they were able to go into this largely because of the educational qualifications that they had gained. But at the same time, they reflected on how this work was quite limited and limiting for their lives. So in that sense, they really recognized both the successes and failures of socioeconomic change in India. And I think this is an important point to make here, because what we find often in research is that there's either discussion about how socioeconomic change has been a complete failure in India and people's lives haven't progressed and haven't made it to where they were expected to be, or there's quite a lot of commentary on how great this has been, and you often read that in the media, right? So economic growth has led to all of this prosperity and increasing middle class and so on. What we see through these women's narratives and critical reflections is that they actually recognized and engaged with both the successes and failures of socioeconomic change in India. And this is where some of the class articulations start to come in. So they described themselves in various ways as lower middle class simply in the middle. They said we are neither gaye guzre or destitute, nor high-fi or high class. So there was some identification with lower middle class, or simply being in the middle, but they also described themselves in the negative as not high class and not high-fi. And this is where it's important to point out that the way they thought about class, and I think the way we all think about class, was hugely relational. So they pointed to other people as examples of people who were high-fi and high class, including to me. So in their interactions with me, they would say, we know you're high-fi, we know you're high class, but we are not, we are in the middle. And again, we can get more into this discussion in the Q&A if you want to, because I would then go back and say, what makes you say I'm high-fi or high class? And there were different indicators that they pointed to that suggested to them that I was not the same class background as them. And again, in the research, this is a difference that I engaged with rather than trying to hide it or shy away from that discussion. This is a discussion that I engaged in. I think a discussion that was actually hugely productive in advancing my own understanding of class. So the reference to being in the middle emerges largely as a reference to class position. But I also felt like, again, this is important in the sense that I spent long periods of time with them. I felt like that the middleness was a reference to something beyond class. It was about class, there's no denying that, but it was about something that went beyond class as well. So I started exploring it a bit more and thinking about it a bit more, and became interested in wherever they mention being in the middle. And this came up then not just with reference to class, but with reference to many other things, some of which again Sidra mentioned, and I'll talk about as I come to the different chapters of the book. Now, what we find in discussions about the middle class, and there is quite a lot of research on this now, is that gender is often overlooked as a category, or if gender is engaged with, it's really only engaged as a subsidiary category, as a category that's kind of second tier. So class is at the top, and then gender emerges sort of underneath it. And this is not how I see it. So in this research, I saw that gender and class were actually impossible to separate out, and caste also. And I'll not get a chance to talk about caste to the same extent in this presentation today, but again, happy to answer any questions around that if you have them. So what I found is that gender was completely inseparable from class, and this middleness that they were talking about was in that sense a reference to class, but it was very much also a reference to gender and the way gender was positioned in this larger scene of socioeconomic change. One of the other things that I wanted to avoid doing was reproducing this middleness that's referred to specifically with reference to women in terms of being in the middle of tradition and modernity. And this is a trope that again has been reproduced in scholarship over a long period of time. And this is not me denying that this has some value or this has some significance, but actually what again I found was that rather than just being in this kind of tradition modernity debate, women were positioning themselves much more broadly with in context to and with reference to a lot of different kinds of debates that go beyond just this discussion of tradition versus modernity. So what I do in the book is develop an understanding of middle, which is an expanded understanding where I see it as both a position and a strategy for navigating life in socioeconomic change. So I see it as a position where class, gender, and caste are completely entangled with each other. I also see it as a position where anxieties about reconfiguration of social relations come to coalesce. And in that sense, I see it as a position that actually needs more serious attention in research, in scholarship. I see it then also as a gendered strategy for navigating the flux, the uncertainties, the instabilities of socioeconomic change. So just to tell you a little bit about the structure of the book, because I think this will help to make sense of what I'm about to offer to you after this. So in the book, what I do is, as I said, make micro-macro links, positioning women's narratives and everyday experiences within these broader processes of globalization, development, and modernization. What I do in each chapter is actually think about some of the things that have emerged as a result of globalization in India, and that are things that are actually quite important now to young people's identities. So I think about things like smartphones, I think about genes, I think about actually jobs that they're going into and the way that they talk about these jobs. I see all of these as objects of globalization, as things that are in circulation as a result of globalization. And I think about how women interact with them. So in each chapter, as they come into interaction with this particular object, there's some new identities that are emerging, there are new subjectivities that are emerging that women both identify with and identify against. And again, this will become evident as I talk about the book in a little bit. What I've tried to also do overall in the book is to offer a loose trajectory of women preparing for entering, experiencing, and then quitting this work. And this quitting work is actually quite important because I think it helps us to understand these wider working lives that women live rather than just place focus on employment of a particular kind. So when I talk about women's working lives, I think about their employment in relation to and always situated in the broader life project, where women also do domestic work, where they also do unpaid care work, where they also go and enroll themselves in skills training programs or seek higher education. So I see all of these as tangled up with one another. And these are the trajectories that then emerged. So what I observed through my research is that women had quite fragmented work trajectories. So if they entered a job in a cafe, for example, they might stay there for 6 months and then leave that and then go and work somewhere else for a little bit. And then they might leave that and actually go and pursue higher education. So there was quite a lot of movement. And this is where my methodological choices came in, again, as Sidra said at the beginning, because what I could have done is just stayed in a cafe and done a study there. But when I saw that women were moving around and participating in different kinds of things that were not just about work, but related to work, I decided to follow all of those and try to conceptualize these working lives more broadly rather than just think about employment in that sense. So what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk today is to offer you insights into each of the chapters of the book. I'm going to introduce you to a new character in each chapter and the thing that they come into interaction with, and what are some of the discussions that came up and how women identified with and identified against those positions. So hopefully build this sense of where middleness really comes in. So the first person I want to introduce you to is Prachi. I met Prachi quite early on in my fieldwork when I went to a cafe close to where I was living in South Delhi. Over the course of a few weeks, I introduced myself to her as a researcher. I told her about my research, what I was hoping to find. And I started frequenting the cafe in the mornings when the manager was usually not around. So the manager would turn up at midday and these women would be there opening the cafe and setting up shop. And I would just go there, sit around and have conversations with them. Prachi would usually greet me with "Good morning, ma'am," a greeting that's become, again, very common in urban India if you enter any of these spaces of cafes, malls, or offices in high-rise buildings. Now, a few weeks into getting to know Prachi and being in this cafe, Prachi actually quit this work because she had an argument with the manager over taking some time off. But our relationship continued outside of her work. I want to say a little bit more about Prachi because I think she's a really interesting character and she features quite a lot in the book. She's the only person I know who has read Chetan Bhagat's The Three Mistakes of My Life and Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice with equal enthusiasm and can speak actually equally well about both of those books. She told me that she read novels to improve her spoken English. She said, "I really like reading novels. You know, everyone says the kind of locality I'm from and the kind of school I've studied in. I went to a government school. Everyone says it doesn't seem like that. I mean, my spoken English is good. Everyone asks me where I learned English, but I never went for classes. I've never even gone for tuitions. It's all so expensive." Now, what Prachi refers to here is something that was commonly shared among her peers as well, which was the recognition that speaking English is an absolute requirement if you want to go into this new service economy in urban India. But most of them had studied at Hindi medium government schools, and they identified this as a shortcoming. This gap was then filled by these skills training centers that I was talking about a few minutes ago. And the image that you see here, Angrezi Ki Pathshala project by Pardesi's Institute of English Coaching, is something that was quite common. So you would see these sorts of posters and boards and skills training centers walking around the narrow lanes of Khanpur and Dakshinpuri. So most of them had studied at Hindi medium schools, but then gone to these skills training centers to improve their spoken English. And then Prachi was actually quite unique in trying to, continue improving her spoken English by reading all of these novels. She was also keen to practice her English. So whenever I was around, she would talk to me in English because she felt like she could get some practice out of it. Now, interestingly, her friends didn't like this too much. And one of her friends on multiple occasions rebuked her, telling her to stop speaking in English. On one occasion, she said, "Madam, don't try to be such an Angrez or don't try to be so English. Even ma'am," and she was referring to me, "even ma'am speaks to us in Hindi." So the suggestion was that even I, who lived in the UK, spoke to them in Hindi, but Prachi was somehow putting on this pretense of being a fluent English speaker and making it a point to speak in English even when she was just socializing and was with her peer group outside of work. What interested me in this were the boundaries that they drew between ma'am, which is how they referred to me, and to customers, so that was a marker of respect, and madam, that seemed to be a term to mock and insult to some extent. I think what this signified really was that all the women recognized the importance of English, and this is why they went to these skills training centers to learn how to speak English better. They also kept it at a slight distance. So they only used it when it was necessary, which was basically in workplaces, and otherwise discarded it when they were outside of workplaces and hanging out with each other and just socializing. And I think this is important to note because it disrupts this idea of English speaking aspirational youth in urban India and actually shows that the women recognized themselves the limits of acquiring English skills later in life. So they knew that they have to do this to enter the new service economy, but that they're never going to be able to speak it as fluently or naturally as those who've had an English medium schooling. And this is obviously very differentiated by class in India and South Asia more broadly. The next person I want to introduce you to is Chandni. So Chandni was in between jobs when I met her. And again, this was fairly common. Quite a lot of the women I met were just in between jobs. And again, an indication of the fragmented job trajectories, work trajectories that they had. So Chandni had started working at the age of 16, and her first job was in a call center. This was a younger age than most of her peers. So most of the women started working around the age of 18, 19, but Chandni was very keen to become financially independent even at a younger age. So she started this first job at the age of 16, despite her father's objection to it. From that first job in the call center, she transitioned to a small office where she told me she met her first boyfriend, Rohan. She told me that when she first started going to the office, she was a village type girl or a Dehati girl who would wear her hair in oily plaits and had no interest in boys and was not into this culture of dating or pursuing romantic relationships. But she said that with time, and obviously with participation in this work in the office, her appearance and her inclination towards romantic relationships changed. She learned to travel around the city, around Delhi, going on the Delhi metro in shared vans called Grameen Seva, and there's an image of the Grameen Seva here, as well as in her boyfriend's car, which was a Tata Nano. Now, the Tata Nano, I think, is important here. It needs to be noted that it's not just another car. This is a car that launched in 2008, so actually quite close to the time the Select City Walk Mall was built, and again signifying that period when economic growth was starting to appear through all of these objects of globalization as I identify them in the book. So the Tata Nano launched in 2008 had a modest price tag at the time of 1 lakh rupees. And it captured the aspirations of growing middle class population who had previously only had access to motorbikes. As the world's cheapest car, the Nano was dubbed the people's car, becoming an object that symbolized India's capacity to innovate and integrate with global lifestyles. So Chandni told me, Rohan used to take me out in his car. He had a Nano. Office people got us to talk. Then they said Chandni turned out to be very fast forward. But I wasn't attracted by his car or bike. I know besides love, you have to think of finances, but that wasn't it. Now, similar to Madam, fast forward is a specifically gendered tag. Now, if we think about it in quite simple terms, fast forward means to play something at a very high speed or to rapidly wind it forward. So mobility and speed are of essence in defining something or someone, in this case, as fast forward. In Chandni's context then, her colleagues' use of the term is a reference to the mobilities that Chandni seemed to be gaining quite quickly through her relationship with Rohan. With Rohan's family being wealthier, as is evidenced by his family having a car that he drove around, the relationship signaled upward class mobility for Chandni. His car and motorbike also afforded her greater physical mobility around the city and enabled their participation in the urban culture of dating, which could include the possibility of sexual exploration. Now, Chandni, when she told me this, was very agitated that her colleagues had called her fast forward, so she did take it as an insult, and it was indeed meant as an insult. In contrast to that, she asserted that her colleague's understanding was wrong. Her relationship with Rohan was not motivated by the promise of mobility. If anything, she only saw her work as important in this context. She saw her work as affording her mobility. So she really asserted her work as being important to her life rather than the person she was with, the boyfriend that she had. And Chandni eventually ended this relationship and moved on to another job, again asserting that she wanted to make her life by working and by being in the new service economy. And the mobility came with it, but that's not why she was in this work. So there were again these kinds of contradictory assertions between wanting to participate in these new cultures, including the culture of dating, engaging in romantic relationships, but then also sidelining them when faced with insults like fast forward. Sheila is a friend of Prachi. I met Sheila in the same cafe as the cafe where I met Prachi. Sheila was the eldest of 5 siblings. She had completed secondary schooling like the other women I worked with, but she hadn't been able to enroll in a distance learning undergraduate program because she just didn't have enough money to do it. She said that she needed to support her younger siblings' education with her income. She told me, "I don't want what happened to me to happen to them," referring to her own inability to pursue further education. So she was quite keen that her younger siblings should actually be able to study as much as they wanted to, something that she had herself not been able to do because of her family's financial circumstances. While Prachi left her cafe job soon after I met her, Sheila actually worked there for almost 2 years, so quite a long period of time, in an attempt to stabilize her family's finances. She told me that the situation was improving somewhat, but it was still quite tentative. She bought a new smartphone, and one of the days that I went into the cafe, she showed me this new smartphone that she had bought. So she took it out quite carefully, gave it a wipe, and then showed it to me. She said that this had a very nice selfie camera, and she was quite excited about using it to take selfies and post on social media and so on. But she also told me, "I'm so scared of losing my smartphone. This is why I don't go on the bus. Last time I went on the bus, one girl's phone was stolen, another one's purse was stolen." She started crying, and I just got scared. It is scary. We buy phones with such hard work, putting small amounts of money together, can't let it get stolen. Now, I think what Sheila's narrative really does here is provide an antidote to this popular discourse that suggests that smartphones are ubiquitous in India. And this is something that's become a more prominent discussion now, with digital India becoming a big thing as well. And I'm not suggesting that people don't have access to smartphones. There is, of course, an increased access to smartphones, but I think what Sheila's narrative really shows is that it's not an easy access necessarily. This is something that she had managed to buy with the income that she was earning from this job, but she was actually quite scared of losing it. She had put away small amounts of money to be able to afford to buy a smartphone. But this was also more broadly, so this anxiety around the phone getting stolen was also more broadly reflected in the seemingly contradictory class claims that the women made. So we saw earlier that they talked about being lower middle class, being in the middle, being middle class, but at the same time, they also said that they were not proper middle class. And what they really meant by this was that they did not have the security, the stability that middle class life promises. So they saw themselves as kind of tentatively moving towards middle classness, but not completely so. And there was always the worry that a job loss could, for example, lead to them falling back into being working class. So it was a very kind of tenuous hold that they had on middle classness. What was also related to this anxiety was the changing role of young women in their households. So Sheila's mother worked as a domestic worker and she earned a small amount of money. Her father was long-term unemployed and all her younger siblings were in education. So in that sense, actually, Sheila was the main provider, the main breadwinner for the family. And this was a fairly common story across many of the women who I worked with, where their fathers were not working, their brothers might be working, but were not necessarily contributing to the household. So these young women really became breadwinners for their families. But it was interesting in that they didn't want to threaten gender norms within the family. So again, they kind of looked at it tentatively and were quite careful about how they negotiated it. So they would usually hand over the income to their mothers, and their mothers would distribute it for various kinds of household expenses. And then they claimed some of it back, a small amount, just as pocket money to spend on some things like smartphones, and mostly on these kinds of new items of consumption that the parents of the previous generation would not have really thought important, or these were things that were not available at the time. So they were participating in this, and in that sense, there was this kind of simultaneous changing breadwinner role and changing consumer role. But it seemed like women were hesitant in claiming the breadwinner role fully, even though it was very clear that they were breadwinners for their families. And instead of that, they kind of claimed this consumer role a bit more fully compared to the breadwinner role. So again, this kind of identification and disidentification going on with changing sources of income, with changing positions in the family, in households, and changing consumption cultures as well. So Jahanvi had worked in a cafe. When I met her, she was changing jobs. She was going to go work in another cafe. Now, Jahanvi's parents, she told me, had worked as presswalas their entire lives, ironing clothes at a small stall that they set up in one of the neighborhoods close to where they lived. This is the work that her grandparents had also done. So she was the first in her family to kind of break out of that generational occupation of ironing people's clothes, and the first one to go into the mall. And she told me that when she first started looking for work in the mall, her father was very opposed to it. He felt like he didn't know what this job would entail, and there was a lot of anxiety around what she would do there. So he was trying to stop her from going to the mall to work. But Jahanvi was actually really assertive about it. And again, this is something that struck me as very interesting and actually very important in this broader conversation about women's workforce participation. The women I did this research with were often very keen to go into work. So in Jahanvi's case, when her father said, "No, I don't want you to go to this work," she got really upset and she told me that she cried for 2 days and basically went on a hunger strike and didn't eat anything for 2 days. And she said that she tried to get her mother to then reason with her father, which is eventually how it worked out. And the father said, "Fine, you can go to work." So she started going to work in the mall. She told me that this hadn't come easily to her. When she first tried to look for work in the mall, she went to do an interview at a shop, and the person who was conducting the interview asked her to speak in English. But Janvi was not very confident about her spoken English, and we already saw with Prachi some of the contestations around speaking English. She wasn't very confident about speaking in English, and she didn't get that job. Janvi told me that she decided to change strategy and wear a black dress the next day. Now, this strategy, it might seem frivolous, it might seem insignificant, but actually it was quite important. And this is where actually some of the work that I do connects with the work that Sidra and Shannon do as well in thinking about changing ideas around the body, changing ideas around fashion, comportment, and so on. So this wearing a black dress to go to this interview was not a small change of clothes. It was actually a big change for Jahanvi. It was a big change that signaled to potential employers that she was aspirational, that she was ready for this kind of work, specifically in the mall. This strategy then worked for her, and she got a job in the mall. She worked in a cafe where she wore the cafe uniform, which was trousers, shirt, and a cap. And she told me that she also started dressing differently outside of work, discarding her salwar kameez in favor of jeans and tops. This, however, seemed to not go down well with her colleagues. She told me, "Second day at work, I cried a lot, but I didn't tell my parents. I cried because some girls at work told me that I shouldn't try to be a heroine when I'm there. They told me I should wear my work dress from home." So heroine, like the other tags that I've shared so far, so thinking about madam, fast forward, is of course also a hugely gendered tag. It shows that women entering work have to toe a thin line between being professional and being promiscuous in entering these new urban workspaces. So the pushback that Jahanvi got here from her colleagues to me seemed to suggest that her colleagues felt like she was pretending to be above her class station. She was pretending to be someone she wasn't, so she was acting. She was pretending to be a heroine, and a heroine can be flamboyant. A heroine can be basically who she wants to be. And I think this was a way of telling her that she shouldn't try to be whoever she wants to be. She can only be something. So in that sense, I saw this very much as a mechanism for pushing her back into her gender, class, and caste station. Again, this was a fairly common story. So women trying to toe this thin line between being professional and being promiscuous really pushed them back into their gender, class, and caste station, and more broadly appeared as reassertion of gender hierarchies and patriarchy in the workplace, with women largely positioned as outsiders or intruders in these workspaces. Now, again, I think this is an important point to make because there is a growing sense, again, through popular discourse, that these new workspaces where men and women, young men and women work alongside each other are all equal spaces. They're offering women equal opportunities. But what these stories really go to show is that women are still marginalized even within these new workspaces, and actually that these new workspaces can really serve as sites for reproduction of older patriarchal norms and older gender hierarchies. They might just be reproduced in new ways. And this is where the tensions between changing norms and reproduction of inequalities also really come in. The final person I want to introduce you to is Chitra. So Chitra was really good friends with Chandni, and they had previously worked together, but was struggling to find work at the time I met them. Chitra told me, my brother, he drinks and all. That's the problem. You can't tell everyone this is the problem, so I get annoyed with job people when they don't pay. They don't understand. This is why I was working for 2.5 years. Now I don't know what's happening. Both Chinu and I are roaming around without any job. Sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't get it, sometimes we get something. So by sharing this, Chitra reiterated the importance of her income. She told me about her family situation in quite a lot of detail. She told me that her mother did what she called labor type work. So her mother worked as a cleaner in offices. Her brother-in-law, she said, did a normal job, helping out in a local shop in South Delhi. Her sisters were housewives doing ghar ka kaam or housework. And she was, on the other hand, interested in looking for a job. And job is an English term that all of these women use to refer to work in the new service economy. So the kind of work that they were either in or wanted to go into. But this work was proving elusive, which meant that women didn't conceptualize careers in the long term for themselves. So they saw these jobs as important, but they also saw these jobs as temporary. They didn't see these jobs as lasting for a very long time, again, something that was reflected in the fragmented work trajectories that they had. So sometimes they quit work because a company might just shut down and not pay them. And Chitra talked about that a little bit here. She said there are companies that haven't paid her in the past and they don't understand the kinds of problems she faces with her family and she really needs this money. So sometimes companies would shut down and people would be out of work as a result of that. But at other times, women also quit work when they came into conflict with their managers and colleagues. And we see this with Prachi. This also often included sexual harassment, and given that there were no complaint mechanisms in these workplaces, faced with sexual harassment, women often just quit work to reassert their respectability. They also said things like, I'd rather eat less for 2 days than compromise on my respectability. I have to keep my izzat intact, so I'm going to leave this work if someone is being inappropriate with me. So again, there were plenty of stories of this kind that came up. And what I found interesting with these is that on the one hand, you see someone like Jahanvi going on a hunger strike to enter work. So obviously they were very keen to enter work, but it was also very common to see women quit work. And again, in this duality of entering work and asserting that work is something that's really important to them, and then quitting work and saying it's actually not as important as my respect. There are interesting, I think, angles that emerge in terms of understanding what's happening in terms of reproduction of norms as well as changing norms. So just to draw it all together, what I see in all of these chapters in bringing together these various things around bodies, fashion, consumption cultures, leisure cultures, romantic relationships, and so on, is how women adopt a middle position to navigate the uncertainties and instabilities of socioeconomic change. So women both identify with and identify against these emerging subjectivities. They learn English and they speak English in the workplace, but they only use it strategically. Any attempt to go beyond that results in being mocked as madams. They're aware that they cannot fully be ma'ams, a title that they reserve for customers and for those they think are higher in station to them. They gain access to new forms of leisure, but they're worried about being branded fast forward. They earn an income, and there's an independence that, of course, comes with earning that income, but they also know the constraints of that income and are not keen to threaten the breadwinner norms within their families. They fashion themselves as workers, and this is through bodily practices, through comportment practices, but they're also pushed back as heroines, as people trying to do too much and as being too excessive, so they also try to contain it. And then they go into work and they identify as working, but they're also precarious in multiple gendered ways, which then results in the fragmented work trajectories that I hope I've been able to offer you a sense of. Just a couple more important points that I want to make. So this middleness it might suggest that this is a conciliation of two positions. So they're kind of doing middleness, practicing middleness because they don't want to go to either extreme position. But I don't actually see this as conciliatory. What I do see this middleness as is women sitting with these extreme positions and pushing the boundaries of both of those positions rather than trying to bring them together. And I think this is a really important point to make because women are often seen as mediators, as people who can kind of bring two things together, as who can be conciliatory and so on. But I don't think that is what was happening here at all. And in that sense, I think most importantly, what my work shows is that women are not merely passive subjects of development projects. They're not just latent workforce waiting to be incorporated into labor markets. Instead, they're navigating this in an agentic manner and are at the center of a changing social politics in India. Just finally, a note on what's been happening since I conducted this research. So I said that I started doing this in mid 2016, which was over 8 years ago. And I've been very lucky to be able to maintain contact with some of the women who participated in this research. And it's been really interesting following their lives, the things that have changed in their lives, in my life over this period of time. And we've shared that over these last 8 years. So when the book came out, I sent them copies of the book and they've been reading it and kind of marking up passages that they found interesting and sharing those with me. They also sent me these reviews that I was very touched by, and I'm not going to read them out here, but they're on the screen and you can read them. But just a couple of things about their work. So obviously, they also were in India and in these jobs when the COVID-19 pandemic happened, and I see that as an important crisis point at which things did change in terms of how work was practiced and what their identities as workers were. And they've now moved on from the jobs that they were doing in cafes, shopping malls, call centers, into more office-based work and into work which is much more to do with data management and in emerging kind of new digital startups in India as well. So I think their lives and their work trajectories really reflect the broader changes in India. And as I said, I've been lucky to be in touch with them over this period of time and to understand these changes over a long period of time. And I'd be happy to talk more about them in the Q&A if you would like to. So I'll end it here. Thank you again, everyone, for being here and for listening to me talk about the book.
Thank you so much, Asiya. And now we invite Dr. Shannon Phillip for the concluding remarks. After that, we go into question and answer. Hello.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm absolutely delighted to be just adding a few thoughts, perhaps, on how I might reflect on Asiya's book. Sidra's already done a beautiful job with setting the scene for us, and Asiya's presentation was actually taking us through the book, and so we got a flavor of it. I want to actually maybe make 3 comments on why the book is important for us intellectually, politically, and maybe for people who are cultural and socially interested in South Asia. Because the book is doing a lot of things, right? It's an important book for many reasons. To just briefly intellectually talk about it, we are all in the same field. We are in sociology, looking at how societies are changing, how they are working. And what Asiya's work is showing, and the talk was also showing, is that in South Asia, we have a lot of things that are changing and a lot of things that are not changing. There is a lot of change and a lot of continuity. And for us as social scientists, that's quite an important analytical thread to keep in our work, to keep thinking about what has changed in South Asia in the last 50, 70 years or in the last 20 years, but equally the things that are just not changing at all, right? And I think Asiya's work is very sharp in picking up that intellectual point and very carefully showing how some things are changing and how other things are not changing. Another really important contribution, I think, that's coming out in Asiya's work is about class formation. Again, something that social scientists think very carefully about. How are classes changing? How are people's group class identities changing in India? Right? And that's again something quite complicated and difficult. Because in the West, I'm in the UK, some of you are in the US, we have upward mobility. You get a job, you get a good education, then you can get a job, maybe then you can buy a house, and then you can sort of save up money and keep climbing the ladder, right? That's not what is happening in South Asia. That is not happening in India in particular, or so straightforwardly in the lives of the young women Asiya is studying. So how education is leading to work, it's leading to a change in class, in economics, is very complicated in South Asia. It's really affected by a lot of different things, a lot of inequalities that we have in our societies. So I think the process of class formation, as Asiya is pointing out, is different, and it's important to understand the context to be able to really pull out how it's forming, what is happening, and how it's all playing out. And I think in all of this is the really important theme of anxiety and aspiration that Asiya's work is also really touching on. You know, young people in South Asia today have such powerful aspirations. They are really dreaming the world and they want the world. They have so many desires and they see so much on social media. But they are also so anxious, right? Because India or South Asia in general is so unequal, so uneven, that often for young people to translate their aspirations into reality is very difficult. They can have all of these aspirations, but they don't match their realities. And so Asia's work is so interesting and important in, again, explaining what these aspirations of these young women are, but also what their anxieties are and how they are both together, right? So when young women are conscious about how they look, how they dress, how they walk, how they talk, it starts to show to us what is, intellectually why we have to keep these two things alive, the aspiration and the anxiety. And finally, maybe one intellectual point is around the structural problems with South Asian economies and South Asian societies, right? These are individuals who are working very hard. That there is nothing wrong with them as individuals who are, struggling or trying to make ends meet. But there are things in the structure of the economy, the structure of work, the structure of society that Asia's work is also pointing the lens at, right? There are structural problems in India or in South Asian economies that cannot be resolved by individuals alone, right? They need structural ways of thinking. So there are very few jobs, for example. These women are competing in very tough markets for these jobs, right? So the problem with why women are not in the workforce is not because women are not choosing to be in the workforce or that women are not hardworking. There are problems with the job market that we have to take very seriously, right? And I think that's intellectually, I think that's such an important point. And that adds to the political point that I want to make from Asia's book, really. For me, the book is so important and refreshing in emphasizing the political consequences of the inequalities we have in South Asia, right? South Asia is such an unequal place right now. And this inequality doesn't seem to be going away, right? And that's extremely dangerous and extremely worrying for any of us who are scholars or interested in how life in South Asia is changing. It seems very much that the rich are getting richer, the poor are maybe even getting poorer, and the middle that Asiya is talking about are getting squeezed in a very complicated way and in a very complex way. Asia's starting image of the cover on the book, the shopping mall, right? And I found it so striking that shopping mall is such a significant place in South Asia. We have shopping malls in all the big cities of South Asia, right? Whether it's Lahore or Mumbai. And Asia's work is in Delhi, of course. These malls represent so much. They might have Dior, they might have Chanel, they might have Gucci, they might even have like high-end Indian brands. But a lot of that is unavailable or inaccessible to the people working in those shops, right? The inequality of South Asia is so powerful and so profound that we can go past all of this, but never access it, never touch it, never sort of see it, right? And Asia's work, I thought, was really important in thinking about that inequality. What is the effect of this inequality on the guard standing outside or the woman who's scanning our bags? They are maybe poorer women. In Asia's case, the woman who is working in Starbucks and making you a coffee or making you a cup of tea, right? When you're shopping at Starbucks. What are they thinking when you are carrying expensive shopping bags or they see other people carrying expensive shopping bags? The political consequences of this inequality, I think, are really quite profound. And that means things for us living in South Asia, going to South Asia, being in South Asia. And with that, maybe I'll make a final comment about the social and cultural fascinations about this book, right? Again, there are so many things that I can talk about why this book is so important, why this book is so urgent. But maybe if I was to talk about one thing, would be this idea of middleness, right? And I thought that middleness, actually, Asiya's talking about how middleness, might be a way of thinking about the women and women's world. What the book is also doing is saying that, South Asia is a bit in the middle. It's a bit caught between things. It's a bit stuck between things, right? Can we, in India, in cultural terms and social terms, say Bollywood, for example, is really changing, it's really transforming. There are all of these new themes about women's empowerment, about sexuality that are coming up on screen. But on the other hand, violence towards women, homophobia, transphobia, rape, sexual assault, they are continuing. They are often coming side by side, right? And I thought this middleness becomes a way of thinking about South Asia itself for us in a cultural way, right? South Asia somehow, or South Asian women's lives and men's lives are caught in the middle. They are caught in between, right? And we might say that, oh, we have become so modern, or that we are still so traditional, right? But that's too simplistic a way of thinking about what is happening, right? Because Asia's work is suggesting that everything, or we are becoming more and more in the middle. There is a middleness that becomes a very complicated way. There's almost traditions that are becoming more modern, right? Karwa Chauth, for example, or other kinds of events and activities that we do that are traditional. That's now much more money oriented, much more capital, much more sort of expensive to do. But then you have these modern women who are still acting in very traditional ways. So can we really say that we are modern or we are traditional, right? The whole idea of thinking about modern and traditional becomes much more complicated. And I mean, feminist scholarship has been doing that for a very long time. But I think Asia's work in this idea of middleness becomes a really interesting and important way of thinking about all of these things. So I'll just stop there and just to emphasize that I have really enjoyed the conversation, to be being in dialogue with Sidra and Asiya, both of you, but also just hearing the book in its expansive form. And I look forward to more Q&A discussion. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Wonderful conclusion remark. And now we have an announcement for the coming Saturday. After that, we enter into question and answer. Well, Saturday is very much on what the lower middle class in the South Asia does. The poet, Faiz Ahmad Faiz, entire life was basically related to that kind of thing. So we have a wonderful singer who's a student at Delhi University, and she is a very trained singer in all the khayal, tumris, dadra, ghazals, and all those. Yusra Naqvi. She is going to perform in place of Danish Iqbal, who takes usually the place. And he is busy momentarily. So Yusra will be the coming Saturday artist. Thank you very much. And now Dr. Rafat Hussain will moderate the question and answer session. Rafat.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Raziuddin, and thank you, Dr. Asiya Islam, for narrating the beautiful and encouraging stories, and Dr. Sidra Kamran for a beautiful introduction, and of course, Dr. Philip for thoughtful comments. So thank you, all three speakers. And the question and answer session is open now. And you can raise your digital hand, those who know how to do that, or put in a chat box. Are we going to, Razi bhai, open the chat box now, or otherwise you can simply...
It is open now. It is open.
Okay, great. Thank you. So that's good. So let's see if there is any digital hand. Yes, there is. So let's begin with our own Dr. Nazir Ahmed. Please go ahead, Dr. Saab.
Thank you, Professor Asiya Islam, for a very insightful, informative, and thought-provoking presentation. My question relates to the inexorable impact of technology on culture and structure. It seems to me the study that you have presented for the time period, say, starting with 1990 until modern times, coincides with the emergence of the internet and whatever it did to flatten the world and enable many people, not just in India, but in Philippines and Mexico, many parts of the world, to enter the workforce. The end result of it was further economic centration, because it appears to me the technological changes that we see are operating within a paradigm of capitalism, the end result of which is increasing centration. Professor Shannon briefly put his finger on that. Is unavoidable. My question, ma'am, relates to what is happening now, which is the emergence of AI. How do you see the emergence of AI impacting the millions and millions of people who have barely entered the the economies of the world? Most of these jobs probably are going to disappear. How do you see that impacting the emerging human cultures, structures, politics? How do you think people are going to manage these aspirations? Because it seems to me the only independent driver is technology. All we can do as people, managers, cultures, structures, politicians, whatever, is to manage it. Your comments, ma'am.
Would you like me to respond to each question, or did you want to collect a few and then I respond to those?
I think it's okay if you can respond. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm glad that Shannon and Sidra are here as well. So, if you have comments to add, please do, because I'm sure you have responses to all of these questions that will come up. So thank you for that question. It's obviously quite wide-ranging, and I thought there are two things that I would like to highlight here, again, speaking from my research. The first really is that when I did this work starting in mid 2016, as I said, these women had quite fragmented work trajectories. And one of the things that I became curious about was what are the kinds of jobs that would enable them to stay in that job for a longer period of time and perhaps develop it into a career, because they were making this distinction between job and career, where they saw job as something temporary and career as something more long term, but that seemed out of reach for them at the time. And one of the most common responses I got to that was we would stay in it if it was office wala kaam or computer wala kaam. And of course, these two were very tied together. So they were referring to technology related work, but they were also very much referring to the material cultures that technology related work enables. So they wanted to work in an office that was air conditioned, that had a desk, that had a chair that they could sit on, and they would work at a computer. And I think what was interesting beyond just the material culture of it was that this seemed to promise to them some dignity of work. So rather than talk about technology as something that they feared that was going to come for their jobs and they were not going to have these jobs in the future, they actually saw technology as something that could potentially give them better dignity in the work that they do. So it was quite aspirational in that sense. And I briefly mentioned some of them have managed to move into more of this kind of computer type work or office type work. That's what they're doing now. They've gone out of the jobs that they did in cafes and shopping malls and so on, and gone into more of this desk-based, computer-based work. So that's kind of one part of the answer. The second is really now thinking about it with reference to this growing discourse of digital India. And again, I find this very interesting because with digital India, and I think again, the comments that Shannon was making about South Asia and some of the trends that we see in South Asia. What Digital India is really pushing, in contrast to what we hear in countries like the UK and the US, is that technology is going to be amazing, right? So technology is going to create all of these new jobs and everyone's going to work in technology related jobs and so on. So it's a very different narrative. And you do really see it if you go to these countries. So I've done some work on digitalization in India, and I did field work in Delhi again, another round of field work in 2022. And one of the things that really struck me was how positively people spoke about digitalization. And I am not saying this to reproduce that positive association with digitalization at all. So I'm not suggesting that digitalization is going to be great in India. We're already starting to see some of the repercussions of it. We've seen the damage done by digital identities being linked to people being able to get basic necessities in life. So we've already seen some of the negative repercussions of that. We can also see some of the hyper surveillance cultures that are developing not just in work but also politically as a result of digitalization. So I approach it with a lot of caution. But I think as far as the narrative is concerned and these women's lives are concerned, what I find interesting is this positive association that seems to be in contrast to some of the narratives that we see in the UK and the US, which are largely around fearing technology and fearing digitalization and fearing artificial intelligence and so on. I can say a lot more about this, but I know that there are other questions as well. I wondered if Shannon or Sidra, you wanted to add anything on this at all. Yeah.
Thank you. So the next one is Dr. Iltafat Hassan, please.
Thank you, Rafat, and thank you, the three speakers, for a wonderful presentation. I visit India once or twice a year. I work in US, but my company, my pharmaceutical company, has two facilities in South in India, one in Chennai and one in Bangalore. What I see there is a lot of job rotation because there are too many jobs in the pharmaceutical industry. People come and go like you would not believe. They will accept a job and then turn it down because they have a better offer from somewhere else. I also read a very interesting note about the industry in South India. It is that there are a lot of small companies that make parts for the car industry, and they have a problem finding workers. As a result, they are thinking about going from labor to these automatic machines, robotic machines that can make the parts. Whereas in the north, Bihar and UP, there is quite a bit of unemployment. The industry is not well developed there. So they import a lot of people from north who come to work in south. They get trained, and then when they go back home to visit their families, they don't come back. So I saw this incredible disconnect between north and south. And are there things that can be done to bridge that gap? Because there are people in north who can do, like in my industry, we need people who have a degree in chemistry so you can work in the lab. What is it that is missing that people from north are not getting that education or those skills and going to south where where there are a lot of jobs? Thank you.
Thank you. I think you would be best suited to answer that question, actually, because you're seeing much more of it than I am. So there are these regional variations, of course, and I can't fully comment on them because I haven't done work in South India. So what I know about South India is based on the wider scholarship that I read. But I thought I would comment on the issue of high turnover rates, and you might be actually talking about a different class of workers than I am. But at least with the research that I've done with the class of workers I look at, what I found was that this high turnover rate was actually a result of the precariousness of work that they were in. So this is also a theme that I explore a bit in the book and that I've continued to explore since then. Again, this kind of distinction between jobs and careers. As I said, women often left this work, so it kind of gave the impression that there were plenty of jobs around, that they could just leave one job and then go and do another one. But actually, it wasn't that straightforward. It wasn't that simple. It was a very competitive job market, and they often struggled to find employment. Again, we see with Chitra talking about we've just been in between jobs and we've not been able to secure anything stable, and we want stable employment. But I think what then resulted in women quitting work themselves is that they never managed to develop an attachment to this work just because of the way it was structured, the way that it was actually quite precarious. They didn't know if they were going to have that job tomorrow because that company might shut down. They didn't know if they were going to have that job tomorrow because they might face sexual harassment that there's no redressal to. So I think that they never really fully attached themselves to the work that they were doing, and therefore were not long-term invested in it. And I think this is what then resulted in the high turnover rates that I saw, at least in cafes, shopping malls, call centers, and so on. I think with the north-south difference that you're talking about, one thing that came to mind in thinking about it was just the different labor formations in those regions, right? And different kinds of labor politics in those regions as well. So we know that in parts of South India, there is a much like a longer history, but also much stronger labor and union politics at play. And I wonder if some of that comes into what you are thinking about. In terms of the skills, I don't really know. I mean, I don't know where the skill gaps are in the industry that you're speaking of, because that's not an industry that I've studied, but I would be curious to know more about it, perhaps.
Rafat, can I ask a follow-up question?
Please, go ahead, please.
Thank you. So, thank you for your answer. But something that was kind of obvious to me was that if there were more science graduates, let's just focus on my industry, pharmaceutical industry, where the job is not very difficult to do, is physically not very demanding. You're in a lab. So if somebody has a degree in chemistry or just general science, they can move south, male or female, get a job and get training, on the job training also. So there is there are fewer workers in south, and that's why there's huge competition for those people, and that's why they keep going from one company to the other. It's not that the work environment is hostile, it's just there are too many job opportunities. So if there are people in north who would take the time to study chemistry or science and then decide to move south and get training, they can settle very easily. And in my industry, at least, artificial intelligence is not making a big difference. We need people. So it's very interesting to me that why is that not happening? And your comment on that will be very welcome. Thank you.
I mean, I can see Shannon's unmuted himself, so he probably has something to say about this, but I will just say I don't think it's, in my understanding, a simple case of people should just get degrees in chemistry and then move south. So again, this is going back to what Shannon was saying, in that there might be structural barriers to getting degrees in chemistry, and I can completely see that. Again, these places are very limited in government institutions, private institutions are hugely expensive and inaccessible to large populations in India. So I can see that part of the problem. I think perhaps there's also something to be thought about in terms of migration patterns. So you are thinking about just what's happening within India, but there are obviously also migration patterns in which people move outside of India and go and pursue lives and jobs, as many of us have done who are here on this call today, in other parts of the world, and maybe that plays a little bit into that as well. I'll hand over to Shannon.
Just to add to that last point that Asiya is raising, I mean, I do a little bit of research in the South very recently, but exactly as Asiya is saying, the aspiration for people really far south is to move overseas. Maybe that's one of the reasons why this north-south dynamic is happening. And aspirations also complicated, right? Asia's whole talk, I think, was what was suggesting was that some jobs are not very desirable because they don't match what people want, right? And so the aspiration to migrate, for example, might not be very strong. So I worked with young men in Delhi. They were never interested in moving to the south because they didn't like the food, they didn't like the weather. It was, not work, but many other things that they valued in life that they could not get in the south. So they had no interest in migrating. And they were thinking that rather actually we might migrate overseas rather than why migrate to the south, right? Was their dynamic. I mean, and I'm from the south, so I would encourage everybody to migrate to the south. But people's migration trajectories, as Asiya was saying, is so complicated and full of many other dimensions. So it's never just work, and work is never happening outside of society and aspirations and people's dreams. So if that's not going to the south and working in a factory there, that's maybe one of the reasons.
Thank you. Wonderful discussion. So let's move on. There is a comment from or question from Abha. Thank you for this incisive talk. I wanted to know if Asiya has been able to study, observe how rise in consumption, investment in technology added, leading to the crushing debts, has affected the women of South Asia. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Abha, for that question. Actually, so rather than thinking about technology and the rise in consumption or changing consumption patterns, I think this links with the point that Shannon was making in that kind of almost convergence that you see between tradition and modernity, because one of the ways in which people found themselves owing a lot of money to different money lenders that they had gone to was actually for weddings. And this is something that's been historically the case, right? So spending a lot of money on a wedding and getting loans if you don't have that money, which mostly people don't, has been a very common story and actually continued to be a common story. So in some of the discussions that I had with the women, they still talked about, yes, we had to take out a loan for the wedding. The other one was taking out a loan for house repairs or trying to buy a house, although this was quite rare and none of them were really in a position to be able to buy a house. So really the crushing loans came from the spending on weddings more than anything else. The other kinds of consumption that I talked about, so for example, buying a smartphone, women managed to do through these installment schemes that have come up as well to some extent. Again, by saving small bits of money that we see with Sheila. So she'd put away some pocket money each month and eventually bought the smartphone that was shared between her and other siblings. So those are the sorts of consumption patterns. But then I think the bigger expenses were still the expenses that we've historically known about that people have conventionally spent on, and those were largely weddings.
Thank you so much. Ayaz Ahmed Saab, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for your very ethnographically rich and novel work, Asiya. My question is more to do with your theoretical framework that you have adopted. Describing women's job and middle lives through gender and language. That's what you have picked up. However, we know that gender and language has been and continues to be the preferred trope of the dominant caste groups in India to talk about equality, workspace, quality of life, which basically allows the upper caste, cutting across religious divide, a small minority of 10 to 15% population to, in a way, substitute upper caste males with upper caste females, upper caste men, upper caste women. For example, in my work is mostly on the Supreme Court, where we see that when gender talk and gender presence and role in judiciary started acquiring some traction, male judges, upper caste male judges were replaced by upper caste female judges, women judges. So in that sense, while your ethnographic novelty is really fascinating and very enriching, your theoretical choices and your epistemological preferences, they go on to reinforce innocently, unconsciously, etc., the dominance, continued dominance of the upper caste minority. And then with that, their economic practices, social, cultural, and political practices, which means that the preference that they have for communal politics, which kind of conceals this power and dominance of a small minority. So at two levels, epistemological, theoretical, conceptual choices that we make in knowledge production, and then in politics, it kind of converges to exclude women in general, but middle caste and lower caste women in particular, and kind of what Ambedkar described as, surplus women labor becomes the dominant feature of the caste as an enclosed class society. So therefore, how would you like to address this problem, and what would you attribute this problem to? That even while we are doing novel ethnographic work, we unconsciously go on to reinforce and feed into the dominance of that small minority of the upper caste, Brahmin, Savarna, Ashraf sections, and then we kind of become complicit in sustaining those inequalities, marginalizations, and exclusions. Asiya, thank you.
Thanks. I'm actually going to ask you to explain that a bit more, because to me it sounded like studying gender is an issue because we might somehow reproduce caste dominance through that. I don't think that's what you would have meant. So could you please explain a bit more what you mean by the epistemological framework of my study reproduces caste dominance, because it wasn't clear to me.
Right, right. So talking gender without reference to caste in South Asia, across the board, whether it is academia, whether it is judiciary, high courts, bureaucracy, politics, whichever field that we look, gender without reference to caste, as Dr. Ambedkar would never do it. We know from him that how women have been made surplus women and all those analysis. So gender without reference to caste, innocently, very unconsciously, innocently, as an epistemological practice, goes on to reproduce, reinforce, sustain caste inequalities, as well as exclusion of the women as well. The vast majority of the women, 80-90%, they remain excluded, whether from the middle lives or the upper lives, they remain excluded. And we keep talking about the challenges that they face, but then it's a very, what shall we say? It's a knowledge practice in a way, so it is epistemology itself that I think I would like you to reflect upon.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for explaining that. There are two things that I want to say about that. One, I don't think the exclusion of caste is ever innocent. I think the exclusion of caste is always fairly deliberate. Like, people might want to frame it as unconscious, but I don't think it's unconscious. I think the exclusion of caste in the way India studied and South Asia studied is always unethical. It's always deliberate. So that's the first thing that I would say. The second thing is, I don't know if you were here for the first part of the presentation, but I do talk about entanglements of gender, class, and caste. And I did say in the beginning that I wouldn't have a chance to go into caste fully in the discussion of the book in the presentation, but I'm happy to answer questions about that. So the women I was talking to appear middle class, but again, their narratives show that they're far from being the secure middle class. What was interesting for me was that their caste was also low to middle caste. And there were different ways in which caste really came up in our discussions. One thing was that, and this is something that I go into the book, was that they were reluctant to talk about caste. They talked about class more readily. And again, this is something that's different from, let's say, the work of Beverly Skeggs in the UK, where women are actually really reluctant to talk about class. And I think that tells us something about caste, right? So what it tells us is that caste is still a very injurious position that people don't want to make references to if they come from low to middle castes. They'll usually only make reference to it if they're from the upper caste. And even then, there is this political practice of invisibilization of caste and this dominance, at least in the urban imagination of class. So there was all of that going on in the narratives of the women, where they were reluctant to talk about caste. They talked more readily about class. And I don't see this as caste not being important. I see this as caste being an injurious position for them. So that's the first thing about that. The second was that there were different things with which caste came up. So one was often with romantic relationships that women had, where they might be in a romantic relationship with someone who was from a different caste, and this was a big deal. So they would talk about that, they would discuss it, they would say that this would be completely unacceptable. So again, really showed the endurance of caste. They also talked about how their SC, ST cards, or scheduled caste, scheduled tribe cards didn't work when they were trying to gain admission to colleges in Delhi University. So they talked about the failures of some of the caste politics and the way that's played out in India in recent years. So they talked about we wanted to go and study in this particular college in Delhi and it has these reservations, but actually they just didn't allow me to even apply for it, or they didn't allow me to submit my SC/ST card, and therefore I wasn't able to get admission there. Another way that it played out that I think was really interesting and really shows us how gender, class, and caste are completely inextricable from each other was in workplace dynamics. So these women were trying to move away from domesticity. They were trying to not just be housewives anymore and to be professional women. At work, they positioned themselves in between their managers, who were mostly men. So there was a gender distance from them, and they felt like they could never really get to those managerial positions. But they also distanced themselves from workers who were below them in that sense, right? So they talked about, for example, the workers who cleaned the bathrooms in the cafes that they worked in, and that's work that they would never do. And it was interesting because these dynamics came up in several interactions with different kinds of people. So on one occasion, for example, one of the women said that the manager called her up and said, "Can you clean the cafe today because the cleaner is not going to be able to come in?" And she absolutely refused to do it. And she said that she refused to do it because she felt like she was being asked to do this because she's a woman. So the explanation that she offered was very much in gender terms and to a certain extent kind of linked to class, where she was kind of like, I'm being asked to do this work. That's not really my job. I'm not going to do it. He's only asking me because I'm a woman, but I'm not going to be this docile worker who does everything that the manager asks her to do. So I'm not going to do it. But I also thought that kind of relating it to other interactions that I had seen or that I had been part of, this was also saying that's not my work in caste terms. So, in claiming their places in society through these workplace dynamics, there was a complex set of relationships that where caste, class, and gender were entirely enmeshed and again entirely inseparable. In thinking about those questions again that we've been reflecting on, the larger questions of what's changing and what's not changing. So I hope that clarifies the kind of framework of the study.
Thank you. So before we move to the next question, my sincere apology to Dr. Ayaz Ahmed to call her as Sahab. So my sincere apology. So let's move on to the next chat question. In your interaction with these so-called new economy women, what would you say about their general education status in terms of degrees? Additionally, can you also please differentiate them what percentage came from convent school? Also, what kind of education Chandni and Sheila had? And this is from someone by the name iPhone. Please go ahead.
Hello, iPhone. Yeah, I did actually talk about this in the presentation, so I guess you missed it. But the women I worked with, yeah, Aisha says this was already addressed, which is true. So I'll respond to it very briefly. The women I did this research with had all completed secondary schooling. They'd all gone to Hindi medium government schools locally in their neighborhoods. And then they were pursuing education, higher education, university degrees, undergraduate programs through distance learning. So that was the kind of general education status of the women I worked with.
Thank you. So last call for anyone to raise hand or physical hand or put interest in chat box because we have few minutes left. Maybe.
May I say something?
Yeah, please hold on
If
for
I'm
a second.
allowed to?
Aisha
Yeah,
or
that was a yes, it's me.
yeah, because you okay, you raised it again. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for this brilliant presentation, Dr. Asya. And my question is already answered, but still I'm going to talk about it because I think very explicitly you did not address it in your talk. It's related with the knowledge, or rather the ability, the skill to speak in English. How do you think, how much urban-rural divide did you find so far as, I'm sorry, it moved to some other space because this place is noisy. Yeah. Did you find any kind of divide between urban-rural backgrounds of women that you were talking to with regard to their ability to speak English, number one? Number two, how much do you think is the knowledge, or the knowledge of English, or their competence to speak in English makes a difference so far as getting a job is concerned. This you talked about, but still, I would like you to throw a little light on how English becomes a barrier, or not knowing English becomes a barrier for them. And do you think that English has, in a way, till now, it is somehow increasing or aggravating this inequality that we have in India? Inequality in terms of economic opportunities or job opportunities, since you have referred to structural barriers, which is related to Mr. Nazir's questions also. He was talking about again and again people being science graduates and going to the south to get jobs, but through the south, how can they be science graduates if they are in a state of inertia, financial or socioeconomic inertia, to borrow the term from Bourdieu? So they cannot have a degree of that kind that will give them employability. In the same manner, I would like to I would like you to talk about English being a kind of marker of inequality in terms of their employability of these women that you researched on. Thank you.
Thanks, Aisha. So the women I did this research with were either born in Delhi or had moved to Delhi at a very young age. But I remember this one interaction that I had with a woman who moved to Delhi when she was around 10 years old and then started going to school there and was then working in a multinational fast food chain. And she said one of the reasons we moved to the city was to be able to learn English and to do these kinds of jobs. So she really talked about that transition from rural India to urban India. And she said, when we now go back to the village, the people say we've put on these airs and we speak in particular ways. But of course, we moved to the city so that we could speak in different ways. And I think that was largely an indication of what this wider field is like. So this move towards urban India, learning English to go into these jobs, seeing these as opportunities that can improve your life. So that was the context that these women were placed in, and they did also distance themselves from villages, saying things like, we are not Dehati anymore, we don't come from the village anymore, we are urban women and we are urban professional women, importantly. In terms of English being a barrier, I think some of it is evident through what I shared in the presentation today. But going beyond that as well, women talk about how because they learned English later in life, they can't speak it with the same fluency as someone who's gone to an English medium school. And this divide between English medium, Hindi medium is quite important, right? Like, again, largely in South Asia and in India, we see it all the time. This divide between English medium and Hindi medium is a class and caste divide. And it's something that's then reproduced in workplaces. So again, the argument that I was trying to make earlier is that even though in popular discourse, these workplaces are positioned as meritorious, as being open to all, as being super equal for everyone, in reality, that's not the case. And one of the ways that this plays out is through English. And obviously, that's not just about English, it's about English, but it's about these social categories that people are part of that means that they have differential access to English and to being able to speak English in a particular way. Yeah.
Thank you. Next person is Asiya Islam. I think this is the last person. Please go ahead, please.
Hi. Hi to everyone. Hi, Asiya. So I would like to tell everyone that I'm the elder sister of Asiya Islam. I mean,
I was about to say that.
Yeah, that's a reward in itself, being related to such a talented person. I think everyone would agree on that. Okay. So I am a doctor, and I think sociology is quite like intimately related to my profession, because like I have to do public dealing every day. And the thing that Asiya is talking about is the middle class people, or the people who are like recognizing themselves as middle class. So what happens, I don't know if my question is really related to this whole scenario that Asiya is talking about, but I think somehow it is it is related to it. So I would like Asiya to answer that what happens in my situation is I work in a government hospital, and whenever I'm talking to patients, so whenever I'm explaining them the medicines or the treatment, the people who are, I think, I would say from a rural background, they understand us better than the people who are calling themselves so-called middle class. Like they tend to give their own explanations, they tend to go for spurious advices, they tend to listen to the people who are unqualified people who are sitting outside and treating patients like that. So I would like Asiya to answer that how can this problem be tackled, or how is it related to this whole concept of middleness that is like somehow so prominent in India today?
Always super fun when your family turns up to your academic.
um,
Yeah, I mean, I think it is an interesting question actually in thinking about also changing cultures that include these interactions with other kinds of professionals and other kinds of experts. And I think that two things. One is really in thinking about how people are treated in the Indian medical system, right? So that's really the starting point of this, where most people are patronized, most people are often also abused in government hospitals. Things are hardly ever explained to them. They are often asked for money when they shouldn't be asked for money. So there are all of those kinds of bad practices in the Indian medical system that we are very well aware of and that are not outdated, but that continue to today. In that scenario, there's obviously been a proliferation of different kinds of medical, semi-medical, non-medical, pretending to be medical practices in India, again, within that kind of larger system of privatization as well. So when there's that much pressure on government systems and people are unable to access those systems, where do they go? They turn to what's available outside of those. And I can see the urban-rural divide in that, because in urban areas, those private practices have proliferated a lot more than they have in rural areas. So there is that difference that then comes up. And I think that translates into practices eventually. So I'm not, I'm obviously not a medical professional, but I have whatever insight I have, partly through Sadhya, into the medical system in India and into government hospitals in India. And that's largely my understanding of it, where people will go to alternatives that are available to them because of these longer histories of being mistreated by systems that exist that seem to be otherwise more legitimate or legitimized by governments. So maybe that answers.
Yeah, so if I could just take a minute more. Okay, so what I want to is just let Asi come back to my basic point. Is what I'm trying to say is that they tend to listen to spurious videos on the internet, because like all of them have smartphones that Asiya was talking about. They are somehow affording it, and Asiya knows better how they are affording it. So they tend to turn to those spurious videos on the YouTube more. They tend to listen to them more than us.
I mean, I would say you need to ask that question to your medical fraternity, not to us, because I think
Yeah. So
there's something that's
All
going
right.
on there.
All
Right?
right.
Yeah.
All right. All right.
Thank you,
Yeah, thank you.
both Islam, sister Islam. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. So if you see her, you can ask her a question privately. So thank you so much. And we are almost on the top of the hour. So there is a quick question, if you can answer, from Srikant. What were the economic parameters you used to categorize them as middle class? It's a good question. So, and that would be the end of the.
Yeah, I think Aisha's already answered that for me. Thanks, Aisha. So yeah, I relied on their identification as middle class, and one of the things that I say through my research and in the book is that these economic parameters for measuring middle class are flawed, because being middle class is a complex experience, and that's what I try to get to in this.
Thank you so much, all three young speakers. It was wonderful to have to listen to the younger side. And before we finish, I wanted to hand over to Dr. Raziuddin. And thank you once again, all three speakers and the audience, for a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much. Back to Razi bhai.
Thank you, Rafat. And I too have a question.
Please.
Part of that question is addressed to Asiya, and the second part is to Sidra, because it is to do with the Muslim. The law in this whole scenario, there was no case history of any Muslim. So, I mean, they do exist even in less number, and a lot of lower class or low middle class Muslims in India do work actually. They are participating in small places. They might not be going so outwardly as others do. And so the same scenario, what would be the case in Pakistan, where most of them are Muslim. But there is also a very clear class distinction, if not the caste distinction. Although there is a caste, always a hidden caste. So part briefly for the Indian side, where the Muslims are missing, I mean, Muslim women or men or women, and what would be the scenario in Pakistan? There's not much time left, so please be very brief.
Go
Yeah.
first, Sidra.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'll just respond very briefly. Of course, in my context, most of the women I interviewed are Muslim, but there is a significant number, especially because my research is in Karachi, of Christian and Hindu women. So I look at the new service economy, but I focus specifically on beauty salons and retail work, so beauty work and retail work. And there is an interesting history of a significant number of Hindu and Christian women, especially in the beauty occupations. And part of that has to do with how, of course, because they were sort of the most impoverished strata of society, the women in those households were forced into the labor market before the Muslim majority women were. Of course, Muslim women have also always worked, but they have taken up sort of beauty work, which was and is still considered to be even now a stigmatized form of work. And it makes sense that the lowest denominator of society, in a sense, how it is perceived, would end up in these stigmatized occupations. And then, of course, you have Muslim women who had certain kind of gendered barriers to entering the labor force, which is a Muslim thing, but it's also generally a broader South Asia thing. So, people would expect that maybe just only Muslim women have more barriers to entering the labor market. That's not so much to do with religion, but a socioeconomic difference, which plays out historically in different ways. But when I would interview Hindu women or Christian women, they also had very similar concerns about respectability, about status and aspiration, like Asiya talks about. So lots more to be said. There are certainly some differences, but there are also a lot of overlaps. That can, religion is not the only sort of axis on which these things are differentiated.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful way of explaining it. The only thing that I would add is that the reason there are no Muslim women in the stories that I share is because I did this research in a particular part of Delhi, which is Hindu dominated. And I think that actually tells us something about these urban geographies, right? So, again, like thinking about urbanization and narratives around urbanization where it's all accessible to everyone, that's definitely not the case because there all of these segmentations within urban areas where Hindus live in a particular area and Hindus of a particular caste live in a particular area and then Muslims live in another area. So there's a lot of segregation on the lines of religion, class, caste that you can see in Delhi. I did do some work which was broader than what I've shared with you here today and what's shared in the book, where I spoke to Muslim women who were working in a few NGOs, who were doing home-based work like sewing, stitching, again, something that historically Muslim women have done in India. So there was some evidence of that, but I think the urban geography aspect of this is interesting to think about.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Razi Bhai.
Thank you all. Thank you all. Wonderful, really wonderful session.
Okay, and thank you all the participants for being here for 2 hours, more than 2 hours. Thank you so much.
Usually this is a topic which is considered far more dry and people are not that much interested, though it is so important. I mean, when you go on politics, literature, and other things, you will see, but when it comes to economy, labor, and gender, and how they're they know, but they should sit and really learn more from you and from other Islam.
Yeah, but Asiya made it interesting by narrating a story. So
Very good, wonderful. Yeah. So
thank
this is recorded and it will be on YouTube a week after today probably. Faisal is a little sick. He is coming from UK and UK guys have given him really a lot of infection. I do not know what happened, but he said, I mean, one of our hosts, um, a whole delegation went and all came back as sick people.
Yeah, it's everywhere now.
So this is a UK effect on Trump land, you know. So thank you all, and we'll see sometimes again. Okay, and now we end the session. It is over. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you for
For
your
arranging this, and thanks everyone for your participation.
Yeah.
okay.
But
And
still,
YouTube will be
Sidra,
available.
it will be good to really talk on the Pakistani side because that